So what if you decide to separate, or you decide to separate, whether it be to head toward divorce, or you decide to separate because it's just the best thing for a temporary purpose, but you can't afford to live separately right now. So it's more of an in-home separation. I mean, what does that look like? How do you navigate something like that? It may sound weird to some folks, but this is actually a thing. I've heard about it quite a bit. So I want to share more information about it on this video in case you're wondering how to navigate a very complicated and strange situation like that. So stay tuned. All right, so ideally, if we're going to separate, actual separation in two separate places is the ideal way to do it for many reasons. But if you're in a situation, and some folks find themselves in this place, they either cannot afford to live separately, there's other logistics, maybe they have a child with special needs and they need to be in the same household for a while. Maybe there are other physical needs that need to be, anyway, whatever the reason may be, and a separation is decided between you and your spouse, and you can't afford to do it physically. How do you navigate something like that? Well, first, let me say, if you can't afford to do it, if the reason for staying in the same household has all to do with just by preference, I'm going to strongly recommend maybe you rethink that a little bit. Separation is meant to be just that. It's meant to be a time to be separate, and it's impossible to do that in the same home. And in our situation, I'm assuming if you're watching this, your spouse has had an affair. In affair recovery specifically, if that person is still in contact with the other person, the other woman, in our case here as wives who stay, then in that case, that's going to make your life miserable having him in the home. So let's talk about that for just a minute. If, let's say, you absolutely have to have an in-home separation, first and foremost, boundaries have to be created. And in my opinion, those boundaries need to start with you, the person who is betrayed. An in-home separation could be something that you agree to because you had no other option, or it could be because, again, for the family finances, they need to stay in. But either way, you are the betrayed person. So I would highly recommend you consider your boundaries. Boundaries meaning what is okay in the household. For instance, I'm going to strongly recommend that the first and number one boundary is going to be having to do with this other woman if she's still in the picture. She's not allowed in your home. Absolutely not. And I know that may sound crazy, but I mean, what if he says, well, I'm in the basement. You wouldn't have to see her. She could come. No. Especially if you have children. You have to be very, very intentional about your boundaries when you have kids. You're protecting them. You are creating a safe space for them. What are your boundaries? What do you need to have in place to ensure that your children are protected from, because that's traumatic. I mean, kids have a hard time understanding, first of all, what's going on with mom and dad. But second of all, to have another woman coming into the house is very confusing for them. What are your boundaries where that is, that specific department, the other woman being physically present and concerned? What about talking to the other woman? If he's sitting there when you're supposed to be having a family meal and he's texting her at the table, are you okay with that? And I'm not going to tell you, boundaries are about you. I'm not telling you specifically what boundary to create. I'm just suggesting find a way in which to create boundaries that make sense for you in your situation. Is it okay for him to text her at the dinner table? Is it okay for him to talk to her on the phone when you can hear clearly through the wall that he's talking to her on the phone? It's okay to make those boundaries. My assumption is there are times of the day when he is not around you and he is somewhere else where you don't have to listen to their conversation, and you could say it's okay then, but if you are present, that is a no. Absolutely no, you do not reply to her message when you're in my presence. And honestly, that's a big reason why physical separation, I think, is so important, because if you're physically separating and the other woman's still in the picture, you've got to know that even in the same, if you were to be separated in the same house, that can be problematic, and it's going to be really hard for you to heal and recover when you're constantly in that type of toxic environment. Now, having said that, you know, there are some states where to be considered, like if you are working towards divorce, some states, like for instance mine here in North Carolina, is you got to be separated for 12 months, and you have to prove you've been separated. Living in the same home, sharing the same bank accounts, things like that, that is not separated. So some states will not allow you to move forward to the next stage of, divorce if you have not met those requirements for separation. So I highly recommend you consider your state, what the requirements are, and make sure you're meeting those requirements if that is your intention to move towards divorce. But when it comes to an in-home separation, even if it's a trial thing, maybe you guys agreed on an in-home separation just to see if you could get past this, if you could heal, right? And if that is the case, set those boundaries. Be very clear and enforce them. Don't just set them, enforce them. Okay? It's a tricky situation. I understand. And I do know. I'm very aware that there are situations where, financially speaking, there's nowhere for him to go, or you for that matter. Maybe the two of you had moved somewhere, or you're living in another country and there's nowhere to go. I get that. So just take my advice, okay? Make sure that you have created very good, solid boundaries if you're going to try an in-home separation, okay? Yeah, I was separated twice in my marriage, and both times were actual separations where he moved out. The first time we were separated, we struggled financially, and we didn't have a lot of money. So thankfully, we had friends who were willing to let him stay in their home because they were out of the country at the time. So we had a place for him to go that didn't cost us any money. But we didn't know, I mean, had we not reconciled, I'm not sure how we would have afforded two households at the time. I totally understand where you're coming from. And because I understand where you're coming from, I want to tell you, this is why I do what I do. Coaching women like us, and I'm aware that some men watch this too, coaching people like us, I guess I should say, but I do coach women mostly, through affair recovery is important, because this is a unique journey that we're on. And it's not a club any of us wanted to be in, but here we are. So I do know the struggles of separation. I do understand trying to navigate that and having the right boundaries. So if you're looking for someone to walk with you through this horrible time in your life, I would love a chance to talk to you. Right below this video, there's a link to schedule an appointment with me. It's totally free. It's for a whole hour. I do my best to give you some coaching on the call, to give you kind of a sample of what it's like to sit through a coaching call with me. And then I tell you about my services to see if this is something you're interested in. So I invite you to make that appointment if you're interested. And of course, I try to publish videos on here as much as possible. I hope they're helpful to you. And of course, I do have a Facebook group I would really love for you to join. And guys, if you are a male and watching this, our Facebook group is only for ladies. Sorry about that. But I try to keep our group as safe and as relatable as possible for the people in it, which means it needs to stay a female-only group just for wives. So thank you for understanding that. But I'm glad you watched this. I hope you found it helpful. And please, again, feel free to schedule a call with me if that's something you're interested in.